You know, when you think about a problem as massive as feeding billions of people, you'd think the solution has to be just as massive, right? Like more land, bigger machines. But what if the answer isn't about going bigger, but about going smaller? Like incredibly, microscopically small. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to connect the tiniest unit of life, the single cell, to the huge challenge of the global harvest.
Stuff like this is literally the fuel for our entire civilization. Grains provide the basic energy that feeds billions of people every single day. And you'd think the solution to feeding everyone is simple, right? Just grow more. But as we're about to see, it's not nearly that simple.
And yeah, here's the big catch. Our population keeps growing, but the planet, it's not getting any bigger. We can't just keep clearing more and more land for farms forever. So we're staring down this critical challenge. How do we get more food without wrecking the very planet we depend on?
So to crack this massive problem, we have to think small. I mean, unbelievably small. Turns out, the key is hidden from the naked eye, tucked away inside every single plant, in the fundamental building block of life itself. Okay, so before we dive into the microscopic stuff, let's just take a moment to pull back and really get a sense of the scale here, because the numbers we're dealing with are just staggering. Let's just take India as an example. To feed its growing population, the country's going to need more than 250 million tons of grain every single year. I mean, that is a mind-boggling amount of food to produce, to harvest, and to get to people.
And this chart, wow, it tells a really powerful story. Between 1952 and 2010, India's food grain production went up by 4 times, which is a huge achievement. But look at the land use. It only grew by 25%. What this shows us is that we didn't get there by just using more land, we got there by farming smarter. And now, the pressure is on to get even smarter.
Okay, so if we can't just keep expanding outwards, we've got to look inwards, right? To figure out how to make a plant more productive, we first have to understand how a plant actually works at its most basic, fundamental level.
And that brings us to the absolute star of our show, the cell. We're about to take a journey from these huge, sprawling fields all the way down into the microscopic world that is the foundation for, well, all of biology.
So on the left, you've got the big picture, a rice field, where our food comes from. And on the right, that's where it all began, Robert Hooke's drawing of cork cells from way back in 1665.
So picture this, it's 1665. Robert Hooke is peering through this microscope he designed himself, and he sees this honeycomb pattern of tiny little boxes. He called them cells, which comes from the Latin word cellula. It literally just means a little room. And that was it. That was the very first time anyone realized living things were made up of these tiny, separate units. And man, Hooke's discovery just kicked off this whole scientific revolution. Pretty soon, this guy Leeuwenhoek was seeing living, swimming little cells in pond water. Then Schleider and Schwann came along with this wild idea: what if all plants and animals are made of cells? And finally, Virchow added the last critical piece of the puzzle. Every single cell has to come from another cell. These simple ideas, boom, they became the foundation of all modern biology. So we know they exist, but what is a cell, really? Well, the best way to think about it is like a tiny, bustling factory. It's just packed with specialized machinery, we call them organelles, all working together. Let's do a quick tour of the main departments, shall we? First up, we've got the head office, the nucleus. This is the control center, the big boss's office. It contains the chromosomes, which are made of DNA, and that DNA is the master blueprint. It has all the instructions for building the entire organism and for directing every single chemical activity inside the cell.
Now, every factory needs a power source, right? And in the cell, that's the job of the mitochondria. These are the powerhouses. Their whole job is to take nutrients and convert them into an energy molecule called ATP. Think of ATP as the cash the cell uses to pay for everything it does, from growing to making repairs.
Okay, and since we're talking about farming here, it's super important to know that plant cells have a few special features. Unlike animal cells, they have this tough, rigid outer layer called a cell wall. It's made of cellulose, and it gives the plant its structure. It's literally why a plant can stand up straight. They also have chloroplasts to do photosynthesis and a big central vacuole that helps keep everything pressurized. And finally, let's meet the factory's gatekeeper, the plasma membrane. It's this flexible layer that surrounds the whole cell, and it's selectively permeable. That basically means it's like the bouncer at the door. It's very careful about what it lets in and what it kicks out. The specific way water moves across this membrane is a super important process called osmosis. Hang on to that word, osmosis. It's going to be a big deal in just a minute. All right, so we've done our deep dive into the tiny cellular factory. Now it's time to pull back out to the big picture. So, how does all this tiny, microscopic stuff actually help us with the huge problem of growing more food? Let's connect the dots. Okay, here is connection number one. It's a big one. We know the nucleus has the DNA, the plant's genetic blueprint. That is not just some cool science fact. It's the reason we can intentionally improve our crops. When scientists select plants that have traits we want, like they produce more grain or can resist certain diseases, and then crossbreed them, what they're really doing is editing that genetic blueprint to build a better plant.
All right, next up. Remember how a factory needs raw materials to keep running? Well, a cell is no different. It needs nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's precisely why farmers use fertilizers and manure. When they do that, they aren't just feeding the plant as a whole. They're literally restocking the shelves for trillions of those tiny cellular factories.
And hey, remember osmosis? That movement of water across the cell's membrane? Well, that fundamental cellular process is why irrigation is so ridiculously important. Making sure crops get enough water at just the right time means we're making sure their cells can absorb all the water they need to live, to grow, and to finally produce the food we need. See? It all comes back to the cell.
You know, when you start thinking about farming from the cell's point of view, it's not just about making what we already do a little better. It actually opens the door to totally new, more intelligent, and more sustainable ways of farming for the future.
This way of thinking leads to some really clever farming. I mean, look at this. Instead of a giant field of just one crop, what we call a monoculture, which can be really vulnerable, this is treating the farm like what it is, a complex living system.
And that opens the door to these really powerful, sustainable systems, like mixed cropping, where you grow a couple of different crops together, so if one has a bad year, you don't lose the whole harvest. Or intercropping, which gets even smarter, planting crops in specific patterns to make the absolute most of the nutrients in the soil. And of course, crop rotation, changing up what you grow each season to keep the soil healthy. These aren't just old-fashioned ideas, they're really sophisticated ways of applying cellular biology on a massive scale.
So there you have it. We started with a single cell, and we ended up with the keys to improving a global harvest. It's just a powerful reminder that sometimes, to solve the biggest problems we face, we don't need a bigger solution. We just need to look closer. So it makes you wonder, right? The cell holds the secrets to life. What other huge challenges, from medicine to climate change, could we tackle if we just remembered to look at the small picture?